Okay, thank you.
I would just introduce you.
Sounds good.
Just a few words. It's really my pleasure and a great honor to introduce Scott deLaHunta, who has contributed significantly to performing arts, especially choreography. And so just to say a few words about Scott deLaHunta, he's a writer, a researcher, an organizer involved in international projects, and currently he's professor of dance at Coventry University and co-director of Motion Bank. Scott focuses on deepening our understanding of contemporary dance creative process. He collaborates with major artists, for example, like Wayne McGregor on the William Forsythe, emphasizing practice-based research. A key aspect of his career is how annotation fosters collaboration between artists and scientists, improving our understanding and transmission of dance. Please welcome Scott deLaHunta, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Clarice. Well, I'll add my congratulations, Clarice, for winning the ERC. That is quite an accomplishment. It's pretty, and to have this the topic, performing arts traditions, theater traditions, dance traditions, is, to have another project of this stature and size on the horizon, on the landscape, really, of performing arts research is great, because I think we miss them. We don't have enough of them. So I'm extremely pleased, and thank you very much for asking me to be here. I was at the 2 workshops this afternoon, and it helped me think about how I'd like to share some thoughts that I've written up for today, for this keynote to start the conference. Just to say that I think what I want to do is I'm going to address the source, in a way, the source of the digitized material, which is the human body moving, the human body practicing, the human body being trained, or human body rehearsing, creating. So this is I'm really going to try to explore questions that arise from the source of the information. As Clarice has said before, as we know, it's ephemeral, it's disappearing, but I don't think it needs to be erased. It should be present in some way, in some form. So this I was thinking about Lauren's talk, because she said, what is the algorithm missing? It was great to sit there for that, actually, and think a little bit about what I'm going to try to do, which is to go quite really in the opposite direction for a little while, and then hopefully wrap it up. So I've been involved for nearly 30 years in creating and studying the digital traces of performing arts practices, specifically contemporary dance. And digital annotation has been, in various forms, has played a key role for most of those years. And that's how Clarice and we met in the late 2000s, because you'd started that kind of project around 2006. But I've always been concerned about the experience and the know-how that gets lost or is missing when dance is digitized. And the rapid development we know now is happening with data-driven modeling and algorithm decision-making. I think that really opens up a new space for asking critical questions about this. What I think of as, and if you read the blurb, the sort of AI preoccupied present. And I'm going to be subtly critiquing that in this talk, but not sort of directly, as I've tried to do in other places. So I'm going to share some thoughts contrasting what can be found in digital traces of performance with what cannot be found, or what's missing in digital traces of performance. And this is going to move us away from the explicit, the abstracted, the standardized, and the codified into the realm of the implicit, the tacit, the invisible, context-dependent, and highly particular aspects in dance practice. But I'm going to conclude, though, and try to finish up with some thoughts about how to bridge this, what I'm going to start referring to as the data-driven and the non-data-driven. It's simply going to research when it comes to multisensory forms of communication. I began as a practitioner. So I began in dance and choreography at university in the early 1980s. And I really immersed myself in this contemporary dance community, mostly in Boston, some in New York. Thought about moving to Montreal at some point. And that community was influenced at the time by various dance cultures and ideas from Europe, Canada, Japan at that time in the 80s. Buto had become quite popular and was around. And my embodied practice involved absorbing these movement patterns, often implicitly, as happens with many bodily practices. And it was also the time that I first became interested in trying to communicate what's happening in that practice, what's happening inside the studio to those who are sort of outside the process. I'm not quite sure why, but I became interested in the possibility that could be done. And I began to think it was important for people to know more about what's happening in the practice of dancing rather than just watching it as an art form. It seemed that there was kind of crucial information to be tried to be shared there. When I moved to Europe in early 1990s to teach at the School for New Dance Development in Amsterdam, there was a kind of subfield of dance and technology that was just starting to take off then. And in 1996, I have to say I had a side interest in computers, so I was already sort of scripting and playing around with them, but they had nothing to do with my art practice. They were just a way of earning a living in a way at that time. But I became interested in what was happening with computers and dance in the early 1990s as things started to take off, and we organized this first symposium on dance and computer technology titled Connecting Bodies. And I put this up there because you'll just see some of the phrases that the language we were using at that time to try to kind of explicate what the interesting questions might be here. So presented there was the 3D figure animation software Lifeforms, which if you're familiar with that at all, you might know that Merce Cunningham, a very famous choreographer, worked with that program. There was also an interactive computer vision software called Big Eye from Stein that allowed for real-time interaction between performer and lights and other things that you could map the data to. We had an early version of internet telematic performance with Maggie's Love Bites from Oslo. That's Amanda Stegel and Per Plateau. But the main project I want to talk about today is a presentation of an early version of William Forsythe's project, collaboration with the Center for Media Art in Karlsruhe, and an early version of what eventually was published in 1999 as a CD-ROM titled Improvisation Technologies, a tool for the analytical dance eye. So I'm going to play a little bit of this in a minute, and I have to turn the sound down, so it's a bit of coordination. But I'm just going to say, and going to draw your attention to a few things here. This actually is a CD-ROM, just a screen grab from the CD-ROM. It no longer plays anything. There is a website now that ZKM has set up. You can visit and see the same kind of material. I'll play it first, and then I'll talk.
And this And this movement you see now, here, like this, yeah, parallel, but folding like this, is called shearing, yeah? And the shear are when two lines that are parallel fold like this and maintain their relationship. And you can maintain, for example, a very common one is a relationship between the thighs and the forearms, yeah? And you can maintain a kind of parallelity, yeah, with attraction and repulsion between four different limbs. Yeah? One. Okay?
So this is Noah Gelber, one of the dancers performing the improv technology exercise called room writing, which I've written here. There are about 65 little lectures by Forsythe on this CD-ROM, each a different one of these improvisation technologies. And one of the things he said in the interview is he wanted to communicate to the viewer the inner things hidden within dancing, which I've written up here, and I'll return to later, this idea that you can make those things explicit, that you can reveal things that are inside dancing somehow. This was really preoccupied us for a number of years. But what was interesting about this project is that it originated not as a tool to communicate that kind of knowledge to a viewer in experience with dancing, but was made for new dancers coming to the company. So in a way, it was made for people who already have an experience with movement, and it was only later they realized that this might communicate things in an interesting way to viewers or people who liked his work or were interested to know more about how that process happens. And it was very popular. It was also popular with people like architects and also scientists interested in attention and perception who had no idea that that kind of mental work, that kind of intellectual, in a way, focus was happening, could be happening inside improvised dance. So it opened up a discussion about the kinds of things that dancers know, but also the potential, this is for digital technologies, to communicate those unique things they know, what they know from their embodied practice. In 2001, then, I co-organized. It's a little difficult. These are a lot of projects I'm talking about. It involved many people. It was always co-organized collaboratively. I'll mention a few towards the end, but it's quite a scope, quite a transition of work. So there were a series of meetings called Software for Dancers. They were set up specifically for the purpose of inventing concepts for digital tools designed for dance, so not designed for film, not designed for still images, but really designed for the ways in which dancers work in the studio. They were adopting various things like iMovie and things was around at that time, so they were using tools, but this was really trying to develop something specifically for their needs, to support creation, also performance and documentation, and also support archiving. And one of the proposed tools, and here's a little prototype mocked up on iMovie, was this idea of being able to sketch directly on video that you're watching. It makes sense. It also was inspired by Forsythe's improvisation technologies, which wasn't live sketching on video. And I worked on a version in 2006 with Zach Lieberman. If you know Open Frameworks, or if you know Zach, he's an extremely well-known now software artist. At that time, he was a little less busy. So he had time to spend a few weeks with me in London and work on this RotoSketch tool. It was in the context of a workshop with dancers who were making creative material. And from the interactions, it appeared clear, almost a bit of empirical research we were doing there, that this could be useful and usable by dancers. This has always been one of the issues, is that making something that dancers can use, that they don't stumble over, that they don't have difficulty assimilating in terms of, the ways in which the interface works, has always been a part of how these projects run. But unfortunately, we were unable to really get enough investment to keep going. But there was an attempt to make a tool, but there were other projects happening already at the same time, and they were getting funded. So, and these were really software for dancers type projects. In other words, the design of the tools and the focus of the research was on supporting the work of the dance artist, which meant understanding the nature of that work and its embodied, and very much, deeply trying to grasp the embodied aspect of that practice. So, as I said, these were already kind of funded and underway by about 2005, and this is an overlap of projects that lasted about 10 years, between 2001 or so, 2010. And I've given you just a visual snapshot for a few projects. You've got London-based Wayne McGregor. You'd heard Clarice mention his name. He was working on an artificially intelligent choreographic agent. I've tried to select keywords and put them in quotes here to give you a sense of the kind of research questions these artists were asking. all very different. Some could be dealt with similarly in terms of technology, but they were all very different and tended to kind of coerce custom solutions out of people and out of teams, in a sense, because you're really working towards that particular distinctive approach of that choreographer and the company that they have. You've got Siobhan Davies translating the liveness of dance into a digital archive. Emio Greco and PC, they made an interactive installation, is on the right there, you see, for transmitting inner intention. This word transmission is crucial because the idea was, well, can we use these things to communicate and transmit to others, which is a little bit different from just simply communicating. It's actually maybe teaching or transmitting in such a way that understanding might get absorbed by another body. So I think this was the goal and the motivation. And William Forsythe using, again, drawing on top of video, a little hard to see those lines, to communicate choreographic organization in a piece of work. So rather than, there's a lot of material online about these projects. There are many, many papers and things have been published. Some of the material is no longer online because it was in Flash. And for other reasons. All of you will know very well what it's like to try to sustain a project over time, how to make it future-proof it. It's basically impossible. And a lot of these projects were culturally funded, as well as some research funding, and we didn't really build into the projects a kind of a long horizon. And that, I'd say, looking back, and I'm also going to look back for other reasons. In other words, I think what Clarice is trying to set up here and really look at closely is something that should has a longer horizon. And I think that's really crucial now for the kind of funding that you need for this. We were very fortunate with these projects, but I question a little bit some of the, not short-term thinking, but just sort of wrapping stuff into a project that just wouldn't last. It couldn't disseminate the way you would hope it could. And I don't feel great about that. But there were two key developments here, though, that I'll continue with. The first was that you had these artists opening up, wanting to share these processes. That was a motivation to open up and share how they make work. That wasn't the case with all artists, but for these particular artists, they thought that was really crucial. So rather than just share their artwork, they wanted to share the process. The second, for these artists in particular, they wanted to connect with other disciplines who were interested in links, for example, between mind and movement, so philosophy or cognitive science, and the study of choreographic creativity. And this really was a kind of shared commitment on the part of these artists to the idea that dance knowledge could make a legitimate contribution to other fields of inquiry. So this moves these projects in a different direction. It really says we have knowledge. It's not just artwork. It's not just aesthetics. It's know-how. It's experiential knowing. It's experiential knowledge. And we think this could be valuable for other fields. And the teams then explored the various kinds of, in quote marks, I'll say, because intelligence is involved in making contemporary dance, and how these might not only be studied, but also made more explicit. So again, we're back to the idea of making something explicit, making something clear, explaining it. All good, and digital technology was considered to have really untapped potential for doing that work. So this was really in the 2000s, a strong focus on exploiting that technology in the various ways, interaction and annotations on video, that they were doing that. And they, as I mentioned, overlapped for about a decade, really emphasizing the idea of documenting work and then disseminating it, dance knowledge really widely and in ways accessible to those who are not themselves dance practitioners. So this is kind of crucial. A third development, a critical question emerged at some point, which I think has been very important for me and will be reflected as I continue to share some of these ideas, is that we got funded to do a network project in 2008 by UK research funding. And we brought the projects together. So until then, they were sort of separate projects. I was working on them separately and had various roles. But we brought them together in a comparative study involving social scientists or social anthropologists. And there we were able to sort of dig into the question of what it might mean for dancers to be claiming to be involved in knowledge production. So what happens when you say, I'm creating knowledge, I'm producing knowledge? Because one of my colleagues, James Leach, with whom I've worked for many years, he acknowledged that the artists are, some of their concerns are having their abilities, the labor, the practices, and possible contribution to society more highly valued. So to value dance more highly on the basis of it being a form of knowledge. But that in a knowledge economy, knowledge tends to be treated as something that can be alienated from its source, so it can be sort of. And this brings us back to the question of what's the constitution of embodied knowledge? What happens when you alienate, you abstract that knowledge from the body? And that became a crucial question for us going forward, and I think is also kind of reflects on this idea of what cannot be captured in digital traces. Again, the recurrent theme here was making the invisible visible, revealing inner things hidden in dancing, making the implicit, the tacit more explicit. There was an emphasis on graphic visualizations or annotations. There was also a sort of emphasis on representing dance without using language, so that showed up a lot when people were trying to represent something graphically, is that we don't need language to show this, although language, as you saw with Forsythe, he's using language to explain, combined with the annotation and the demonstration. But I have to, one of the things that began to trouble me some, and it troubles me looking back, is that I think the focus on making things so explicit, the problem might be is it kind of diverted attention away from that tacit knowledge. It kind of diverted attention away from that implicit, that sort of embodied practicing that takes place in dancing. So in a weird way, it may have sort of devalued that aspect. It didn't really make sure that it remained in view, something that can't remain in view. It's kind of an odd sort of paradox, but it seems to me that we have more that we can do there, and I'm going to try to talk about that now. Carluis mentioned, though, the motion bank project and some of the annotation stuff we've been doing. So I think I'm going to turn to that now for a little bit, because I'm going to go back to this kind of data-driven. I'm going to use a particular project to try to kind of look at this bridging between data-driven and non-data-driven and questions of language. So in 2010, we got funding to start the Motion Bank project, which was Forsythe's vision for an online interdisciplinary research environment for dance. And we worked with 4 choreographers who were commissioned to be part of the project, and the idea was to make each distinctive approach, each different approach, accessible through digital technology. That was to continue doing that kind of work, and freely available online. And this was, these first 4 years, probably the most ambitious project that we'd kind of seen in this area, and a lot of the people who were participating in the previous ones got involved in this one. But the team took a more data-driven approach. So the team led by Florian Jennett, who's still running the project from Mainz, is a software artist. And he wanted to use a much more data-driven approach than previous projects. In other words, processing digital time-based recordings and other material from the invited choreographers, using the computer to look for patterns, to look for things that might not show up otherwise in the data, with the aim to get fresh insights about the work from a more data-driven approach. And the project we did with Deborah Hay is a good example of this, and also some of the challenges. So I'm going to try to explain this. I think probably most of you are not familiar with this particular artist, Deborah Hay. but she's been working for 40, 50 years. She's an American choreographer. Now, her approach to making dances is completely unlike Forsythe, for example. It involves writing a unique kind of score writing process, which she has a very unique way of thinking about how language can elicit movement responses from the dancer's bodies. So she has not in terms of movement instructions or lab annotation, but in terms of language that's more metaphorical, more poetic, and I'll show you what that language is like in a moment. What she did for our Motion Bank project is she gave her written score, and I've tried to kind of describe in brief the process, to 3 dancers who know how she works. So they've worked with her many years before. Their experience with her methods of what they called choreographing perception. So see this is different from choreographing movements in staging, but choreographing the mind in a way of the dancer. They each receive the score. They practice it for 3 months daily. It's a kind of contract. They get no input from Deborah. And then they came to Minds with their adaptation. Now, because there are no movement instructions or staging, each time they perform the adaptation, it's different. So there's a tremendous amount of variation. And yet, it's the same sequence. So what we wanted to do is to try to figure out what's similar and what's different in the dancing in those different performances of the dancers. And so we filmed them 7 times. We filmed each adaptation 7 times. You can see here in the score, there is a sequential structure. We use this. We annotated all of the recordings we had. We had 21 recordings, 7 for each performer. And then I'm going to show you what we did from the data-driven side of things. So from the data-driven side of things, we could extract 3D pathways using computer vision, extract pathways from 3D computer vision that you see here. So you'll see here the pathways for 7 different variations for each of the 3 performers. So if you look at the green, if you could count them, they're a little bit scrambled, you'd find 7. You'd find 7 above for Roz, you find 7 from Juliet and 7 from Janine. Now, they have not had any contact with each other during this rehearsal period. And so the question might be, what does this help us look at and think about? I'm going to play a little bit of a screen grab. So you'll see that each of their performances are fairly consistent, with some differences. I'm going to jump through the annotations to different sections, different parts of the score. So that's another part of the score. These have names. I think you get the basic idea there. So as we fire up, I don't know if any of you know the book by Miguel Varela called Theater as Data. Some of you may know that book. Well, he talks about this particular score that we made. And he says something I think is fairly perceptive. So what does the data-driven analysis? It helps us, it kind of transforms a bit our view of the problem. So what's the problem? The problem is to understand how it is that the dancers assimilate this information. How do they make those dances, for example? And why is it that there's variation at all, and why is it that there's similarity? So we don't really know the answers to those questions. But being able to look at it like this, sort of simultaneously, gives us a different view and a different way of thinking about the problem. He also says that these things don't offer a clear answer, but they augment our capacity to think about such an event. So, maybe I'll jump forward. So that was our data-driven approach, using Deborah Hay as an example. And in some ways, I'm going back 10 years to use one example to talk about a data-driven approach where we try to reveal some things in Deborah's work that we might not have been able to think about the same way without having done this. And I would say that's true. So we're able to think about this differently by taking this more data-driven approach. But here's the non-data-driven approach, also using the annotations in the score. So we did video recall. We invited Janine and Roz to try to explain to us what they were doing at each section of the piece. So on the left-hand side, you see this weird score of Deborah's, filled with metaphor and poetic images and things that they've assimilated into their body, and they know what they're doing. If you stop any one of them during their performance, they know exactly where they are in the score. They know exactly what they're doing. They just happen to be in a different place in the space, doing different movements, but it's the score that they're following. So Deborah says this is not improvised material, it's choreographed. But how is that working? Well, the closest we could get to that is simply asking them, because we can't really capture that. That's implicit, tacit. You can't record that. You can't record brain waves. You can't, there are lots of things you might think you can do, but I would say you can't really grasp the richness of that experiential knowledge from pretty much any sort of extraction techniques. There's another dimension you need to open up to in order to kind of assimilate what's going on there. And in this case, we try to give people an opportunity to sort of contemplate that by having what Janine says on the right side. And I'll just play this here. Hopefully this plays, it doesn't crash. So Janine's performing, and as she's performing, we've annotated the video recording, so it jumps forward to the score and the part where she's explaining what she's doing on the right. And you can go online and look at this, but I'm just trying to draw your attention to something that I think is more non-data driven. It's really encouraging you to move towards, and it's not close reading either. I reject that idea that it's close reading, which refers to text. It's something else. It invites you to come closer to the experiential dimension of Janine's performance that she's sharing here. Ah, interesting. Okay. So, with that in mind, and it's 10 years ago, which is kind of sad that we weren't, but it was difficult to continue that kind of work, to do both data-driven, with unique choreographic approaches and trying to address those, and non-data-driven. And we, in many cases, I think we failed to get much of the non-data-driven. I think when we presented the data-driven approach to some of the artists, it made them uncomfortable, because it meant there was a kind of reduction element there, a kind of abstraction. Okay, so I hope that helps sort of give a sense of a non-data and a data-driven approach that we pursued in the context. Well, just talk a little bit about language, because I think it's been crucial, and I've been thinking more about language, and I think this relates to, so as I said, Deborah's work with language is really central to her practice, and she's really well known for it, but the use of words in the studio is common practice. And it ranges from simply naming. I've tried to drop in a few of the keywords here. Simply naming stuff and describing things in the studio as you're working together. And it ranges from that to a more stabilized vocabulary. So stuff that starts to kind of come together, a terminology that might relate to training, like Forsythe's terminology that he used in the improvisation technologies thing. So words used in the studio, they can constitute a sort of shared conceptual framework that a work starts to come from. The vocabulary often makes use of metaphor, more or less associative. And importantly, they're not pure languages, so it's just not emerging from the body. They're kind of infected and infiltrated by other disciplinary lexicons sometimes. If Forsythe is reading a lot of kind of neuropsychology, he might start using some of that language. I know Wayne McGregor was doing that. Siobhan uses language from landscaping and gardening. So other languages infiltrate and kind of infect. But nevertheless, this kind of area of languaging, I think is understudied in a way, and I think could be important for the work that's going on here. And these aren't movement vocabularies, like particular movements, but they're words. They're expressed in explicit verbal or written form. They might trigger stuff, though, that's not so explicit. So the words kind of intersect with know-how. You don't know exactly how it's happening. And probably the only people who kind of understand that very well could simply be poets who use words and language in ways to evoke emotions, to evoke feelings. So, but if you see the sort of the way in which Janine is making some sort of translation of the language from Deborah into movement performance that she's done, and she's got some understanding about what's happening. That's kind of enough to give you a grasp of the nature of that knowledge that's difficult or impossible to capture, and yet it's always present. So, supporting the motion bank research that we did, both the data-driven and the non-data-driven, was a version of this Piecemaker video annotation software. So I'm just giving you a quick glimpse. It originated with Bill Forsythe's company. David Kern, one of his performers, kind of cobbled it together on his own. He wasn't really an autodidact, self-taught programmer. And he felt that it would be useful to have something to help organize the video material that was shot constantly in rehearsal. So there's a lot of stuff in the database, as you can see here. We inherited this. The Motion Bank project inherited this software. So we didn't inherit the content, which is not open to the public, which is a shame from a research perspective, but it is too complicated to get all the rights to it. Although it has been gifted to the ZKM, to the Center for Media Arts, Karlsruhe, because his entire archive is with them. So we'll see what happens there. But most of these annotations, they're made live by somebody sitting in the space with a static camera while the creative work's happening. And we inherited the software itself and started creating different versions of it. To use, the first version is version number 2. We use this in the Deborah Hay project and other things we did. Later on, there's another version here called the Motion Bank Web Systems that's linked to a publishing system that we've used off and on. But we'd also inherited this, how would you say? Well, the goal was to make an annotation tool that dancers could use too. That was actually the main goal, was to make a tool that dancers would find usable and useful in their practice. So a lot of effort went into making an app-like version during the first Motion Bank phase that I think has kind of disappeared. And this version here you'll see on the right then was the main version for a while, and there's a new version now, and you can all have passwords and logins and make use of it any time you want. But this interest in making it usable and useful, and also to be able to work in real time using freely descriptive texts instead of predetermined classification or notation systems. So there's no predetermined classification systems in the software. And this is a shot of me using the software in Malta to document the choreographic work of a choreographer named Rosemary Lee. And I'm just sitting, there's a camera running here, I'm typing in real time. Whenever I see something interesting, I just hit a key, sets the mark, I can go back to it later and add more material. And eventually I published an online sort of website for audiences. You know, my readership was audiences who'd seen the work, and I wanted to give them some insight into how the work was made. But this is just me on the sideline. I think this is one of my favorite places to be, sitting on the side of a rehearsal process or a creation process. I'm experienced in that space, so I bring my own background, my own embodied knowledge to that space, to what's happening in the space, and it helps me see things that might be important that I can look at later. I can go back and review them. So there's a lot of post-annotation work, but the live work happens. I'm also not looking through the camera, so I'm not distracted. I'm just sitting here and things coming in, and I'm, in the very simple way possible, I'm just marking stuff that might be useful so that I don't end up with 7 hours of video that nobody's looked at. And it works extremely well that way. Just beginning to come towards the end. But a number of projects using that software got written up in this issue of International Journal for Performing Arts and Digital Media. And there were other software tools used, not just ours here. And what this issue let us do is to reflect at how we do sit at this crossroads, suspended sort of between data-driven and this non-data-driven research. Because there is a need, as we've seen today and discussed, for formalized vocabularies to conform to data standards. There is a need for compliance, and there is a need to collaborate with data science. It must be done, and information science. So that has to be done. But there's also a need, I feel, to document this complex and particular artistic practices that these resist classification and categorization. But there's also a need to somehow collaborate there. And in this issue, we focused on collecting the knowledge of practitioners who had worked with the software. So this was this was really filled with examples and documents that artists themselves have produced using these tools. And only with some exceptions, generally the contributions don't feature any discussion of systematic documentation or standards. But when you read their accounts, what you realize is that although they are theater and dance practitioners and they are educators, their reflections do give a sense of standards that are kind of implicit in the process of annotating. They're using a chosen annotation tool. They're making decisions about what to annotate and how. So then the questions that really open up are related to this idea of a practical annotation method, which we haven't, this is really different from people annotating for training data sets. This is something completely different, like a practical annotation method. So what is it to sit in that space and make a decision about an important moment that's happening, that's unfolding in front of you? It's less about marking what's in the video in a sense, but what's happening in the space in front that happens to be recorded by the video. I would argue this is a really, really quite qualitatively different experience of annotation. And there were experiments in dance education. There was online transmission that people got involved with. They also analyzed their own performances and various critical exchanges. And because they're not coming from a discipline like linguistics or psychology, and they haven't used a tool like Elan, they don't have a coding repertoire. So they don't bring that kind of theory. So they invent stuff. So the methodological invention here is one of coming up with the terms that you want to use. Because once they do get fixed. It's just like Forsythe, the different terms that he used to organize his menus and his, I know from anecdotal evidence that the dancers themselves, they don't remember all those. They get fixed for the CD-ROM. But in practice, those words tend to, one dancer refers to parallel shear as bringing I don't know what, something else. In other words, the language in the studio fluctuates and moves around. So it got fixed to allow the CD-ROM to kind of come together as a multimedia product. So we need to commit ourselves to fixing things at some point. But I think what I'm interested in is how does that play back and forth, and what's the nature of things getting fixed? There is one or two collaborations here, and collaboration's how I want to finish now. There were one or two, and one collaboration in particular between Elizabeth Waterhouse, who was a dancer with the Forsythe Company, and Florian Yennett, who is my colleague in Ed Mines, who's directing the Motion Bank project. And there you see a collaboration between dance and data science. So between a data-driven approach and a non-data-driven approach. But I think what's unique there is that the starting point is a close study on Liz's part of the material that's happening in the, that's been recorded, and thinking about that. And then kind of augmenting that with more of a digital methodology. So they're both present in that piece. And it's not, most of these pieces don't have that kind of collaboration. And again, I really see that as a collaboration between Liz and Florian to kind of tease out what they could sort of together say substantively about the pieces she was studying. And here's the most recent version of the Piecemaker software, which is much, much better at supporting collaboration. So I want to finish on my proposal to bring together the world of data-driven research and the world of dance or theater performance, performing arts, is to embark on much more more collaborative and reflexive research that investigates this conceptualization, the documentation, the categorization, and codification of multisensory forms of communication in performing arts. Because I think these collaborative approaches, they will challenge existing hierarchies of knowledge, and they will be challenged by existing hierarchies of knowledge. But they could provide new models and new methods for such research in the future. So I think the practices need to be reflexively. That means one questions one's assumptions and beliefs, and collaboratively research, so you can kind of inclusively account for both the analytic sort of side of research approaches that are more analytic and experiential knowledge. And my last proposal related to that would be to suggest that if such a research is to take place, a collaboration, an equal level collaboration between, not something that we go away and publish science papers, maybe we co-author the papers together, practitioner, scientist, artist, scholar. I think you need a code of conduct. I think you need a code of conduct that first confirms the mutual interest in the value of the collaboration, including the ownership of the results. And I think that needs to be negotiated in an ongoing way because projects change. So I know we all do our ethics applications before projects start. That needs to happen. But this is like an additional code of conduct. This is an agreement, a social contract between collaborators. It says we will keep renegotiating these terms. Now, given what we've been looking at, and I know also with the triple F, the IIIF, and I understand how complicated and big deal and scaled up those problems are totally. In a way, I'm just looking for some small purchase point in there someplace. If you're working with performance artists, what opportunities do you have for a collaborative work to take place? It doesn't have to be the whole thing, it's impossible. But are there not points along the way where this kind of collaborative research could help set a new standard maybe for engaging with embodied knowledge practices, not only in the performing arts, but beyond the performing arts, where there are other practices that are also in danger of disappearing, which ultimately my concern a little bit is not about the ephemeral aspect of performing arts, the living aspect, because from moment to moment we disappear and it's life. But we don't want to be erased and we don't want to be completely forgotten. So I think would be my plea to integrate into these projects, very important projects, this kind of knowledge as the source of your motivation to honor these memories and the heritage of performing arts practices. I just want to thank very much. This talk really is for Florian, who's been amazing, and all the other people I've worked with. And I'll thank you very much. I think I've gone a little over. I really do appreciate being able to share those. I think the work that's happening here is really important. In a way, I hope that, and I think this. I think it's possible to do this kind of work. I sometimes think it seems difficult. I mean, we failed. I feel like we failed many times to capture that ineffable sort of dimension of performance practice, but it's ever present. So how do we manage it? What kind of system? What can we put in place that recognize that value? So.
Well, thank you so much for to me, it's really always very inspiring to listening to you. And I was wondering because it was there is different journeys in what you said. First one is from digital performances to digital humanities. And another one is to go from documentation projects for one artist, one performance, and then you moved to Motion Bank and to the video recording tool, which is more a generic tool. And so I was wondering how you can deal with this from specific project to more generic projects, which is always something that we try to deal with because all these artistic projects are very specific.
Yeah.
And so does it need a specific documentation tool?
I think I understand your question, Clarice. I would say, sorry, I'm going back to the video just quickly. I don't want to in any way denigrate the efforts that were made for these projects, but I think these projects in a way were one of a kind, and they happened in the 2000s, and I don't really see them happening again. There was a desire from these artists to do these projects, so they wanted to do them. I don't sense the same desire generally from the field. I don't know exactly why, but I don't quite sense it. Occasionally somebody will come and say, I love a tool, that I could use specifically. And, but I think that, I think you're right. That's one reason, I guess I showed that image, which is to suggest that that's all I needed to be in the studio and the reason we've been developing the annotation tool so that artists can use it, but it's a very robust, under the hood, it's a very sophisticated piece of equipment, which allows for all kinds of interoperability. It's open source, so it can link, it can plug into various things. But the top part is meant to be easy for dancers to use. What I don't think we don't really know yet, though. The pickup of that tool, and also some with memo recall probably as well. I mean, for that tool to enter into the practice as a natural tool, that hasn't happened yet. Video, I would argue, notebooks, pencil, paper, pens, and video are more or less naturalized as tools in performing arts practices. They're super easy to use. They do everything people want them to do. There is much more notation, labo notation practice happening in France and other places. There's not much happening. These artists don't happen to use notation. But those things seem to be kind of naturalized. They are sort of assimilated into the practice. But video annotation so far, we still struggle to get that really, to see that past the threshold where dance artists see that as something they can really make use of, despite all the efforts to develop something that's usable and useful. And I think I don't quite know what that is. But I feel, I don't know quite what that is. I'm not really sure. But I would say that something more general is required now, yes.
And you just mentioned notation, and something which is maybe strange to me is that you could think that documentation would be for notation and to replay the works and to preserve the works and so on. But most of the time, it's not. Yeah. It's more about documenting the creation process, having a feedback about it, or transmission, and so on. Do you have an explanation about that? About why it's not so useful for preservation of the dance?
That's a good question. I may not be I think we put so much effort into the process of making work. Although Forsythe's piece was a finished piece that he was analyzing. Yeah, I don't. It's a good question. I haven't, I distracted myself from finished works somehow because the direction of travel for the projects and what interested me was communicating the complexity of the process. And so I found it more open-ended to focus on the process of creation or training, or also in terms of looking at the use of language. Because when the piece is finished, during the creation of the piece or in training, a lot of what I said about language and how interesting language is when it's being used in the studio don't really correspond to finished works. So in finished works, those very rich periods of language use have been left behind to an extent. So I think that's why my focus has been more on that.
And I was remembering Deborah Hay during the Motion Bank project saying that because a big part of her work is trying to escape patterns.
Yeah.
And when there is this data-driven approach and with all these pictures, just showing there were patterns. And so to her, it was a very harsh feedback to her work. But it's also, to me, really, and this is something that I discussed also with some directors, is that all these tools is a way for them to have a feedback on the work. And maybe this is more important to them to have a kind of visual or multimodal feedback than to score the work. Mm. Maybe this is one of the interest for this kind of research also.
I think you're right.
So there is a question by Anna Lawetz from the Royal Danish Library online. And so she says, thank you for the presentation. What are your experiences with collaborating with national archival institutions that has to maintain the traces and knowledge of dance in a longer perspective? And so Anna is currently a part of the Dance Archival Research Project Knowing in Motion Dance Body Archive with PI who is Karen Vedel.
I don't have much experience working with archives. I think, again, relating to the question that you asked earlier about finished works, I think and these projects themselves, although Siobhan Davies had an archive, she really struggled with the archive, with creating the archive. Forsythe has an archive, which he's now given to ZKM. That was meant to be included in the Motion Bank project, but we moved it out because it presented different kinds of problems. It's a good question, I think, and not one I've, in terms of my experience. Thank you for the question, by the way, out there. In terms of my experience, I have not had much of that experience, and I'm not sure that I can really address questions to that kind of institutional level.
No, but it's very recent to have dance collections given to institutions. So maybe that's also one of the reasons.
Yeah, that could be.
Do you have any questions? Yes.
Yeah, wait. Thank you very much for the talk. That was quite wonderful. I was wondering to what extent at some point in your exploration of these different tools, I saw the reference to Wayne McGregor. I'm a big Max Richter fan. So that kind of collaboration between composers and choreograph, is it something that you've come across that was like presented additional technical, challenges that you thought we'll leave that for, other opportunities, or were there for some of the work that you've dealt with already musical elements that somehow you could not include in the annotation? So how does music then feature in the creative process and the recording aspect?
Good question. I'm trying to remember whether we worked with IRCAM, with Fred Bevilacqua, who runs the interactive group for a while, and that was with Ennio Greco and Peter Skolton. So I think that in that context, we were working with their composer but again, a little bit in responding to the finished work question that Clarice sort of posed. Eventually, the work with Ennio and Peter focused on a workshop that they give annually, or we're giving annually, called Double Skin, Double Mind. So in a way that a lot of the projects focused in on one phenomenon that they thought they could explore generatively, usefully, with digital tools, and in some ways they were all all accomplished choreographers. So at the end of the day, their performances they wanted control over. So I never quite said it like that. In a sense, I think that was their domain. The space we were in was more collaborative and involved different voices and different agendas. And I think we kept them I think this might have one reason for the finished work that we devoided a bit. It kind of kept them separate. It's like an open space for exploration. So no, we didn't, and occasionally composers came in, but not in a very substantial way. But you're asking me questions that make me think, it's true. We sort of ring-fenced some of those projects to allow us to work on certain kinds of questions in some depth.
Any more questions? Maybe around a drink?
Yeah. It's a long day.
Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. And now we will have a drink just outside. And so, yeah.
Thank you.